Good evening. I'm YAMO. Tonight, we examine a system of justice that shaped Europe's understanding of law for centuries and what happened when that system was later dismantled by force. This is the story of the Ottoman courts Europe studied, relied on, and ultimately replaced. The empire's reach stretched across 3 continents, binding ports, caravans, and cities into a shared commercial space where merchants expected courts to hear disputes quickly and record decisions transparently. For much of the early modern period, the Ottoman Empire governed one of the largest, most diverse populations on earth. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others lived under a shared legal framework that was widely observed by European diplomats, merchants, and legal scholars. What mattered was not just who ruled, but how disputes were resolved, contracts enforced, and power restrained. In lively markets, contracts, seals, and witnesses kept trade moving. Buyers and sellers relied on written terms and timely rulings that turned deals into enforceable obligations. At the center of this system were the Ottoman courts, known as Qadi courts. These courts operated in cities, towns, and trade hubs across the empire. They handled everything from commercial contracts and property disputes to criminal cases and complaints against officials. Crucially, these courts were open to all subjects, regardless of religion. Stamped agreements and ledgers signaled credibility. When parties presented sealed documents and testimony, judges weighed evidence, applied precedent, and locked decisions that could be enforced without delay. European observers took notice early. Venetian, French, and British merchants regularly brought cases to Ottoman courts because judgments were fast, predictable, and enforceable. Records show that non-Muslims often preferred these courts over communal or foreign tribunals, especially in commercial disputes, because outcomes were based on documented contracts and sworn testimony rather than political influence. Across Europe, overlapping jurisdictions slowed justice. By contrast, the Ottoman Forum offered a single venue where rules were clear, filings were swift, and outcomes could be anticipated. The broader context matters. At the same time, much of Europe was governed by fragmented legal systems. Courts were slow, expensive, and frequently tied to noble privilege. Justice depended heavily on status. In contrast, Ottoman courts were designed to limit arbitrary power. Judges were appointed, salaried, and rotated to prevent local capture. Even governors and military officials could be summoned and ruled against. Power met boundaries. Codes and procedures constrained rulers, ensuring judgments stood on law, not favor. Even powerful officials were checked by written rulings and public registers. The mechanism was straightforward but powerful. Law was not an extension of the ruler's will. It was a constraint on it. Judges were bound by established legal schools, written precedent, and public records. Court registers, many of which survive today, show detailed documentation of cases, decisions, and enforcement. This transparency built trust, especially in trade. European scholars took notes, translating procedures, studying registers, and debating how documented practice produced reliable decisions useful for commerce and governance. European legal reformers studied these practices closely. During the 17th and 18th centuries, translations of Ottoman legal procedures circulated in Europe. Administrative reforms in places like Prussia and Austria borrowed elements of standardized courts, salaried judges, and written records features long normal in Ottoman governance. Industrial might shifted priorities. Trade cooperation gave way to competition, and legal admiration gradually hardened into pressure backed by factories, fleets, and finance. But this relationship changed in the 19th century. As European powers industrialized and expanded, their interests shifted from learning to controlling. Legal respect gave way to military pressure. Through capitulations, unequal treaties, and eventually direct intervention, European states imposed their own courts on Ottoman territory. New privileges shielded foreigners from local courts. Consular protections deflected Ottoman rulings, redrawing legal maps and weakening the authority of Qadi judgments. Under these new systems, European citizens were removed from Ottoman jurisdiction. Later, entire regions were taken out of Ottoman legal control. Colonial courts replaced local ones, often privileging foreign interests and undermining existing mechanisms of accountability. What had once been a shared legal space became a hierarchy enforced by force. Merchants felt the strain as trusted pathways fractured. Contracts grew riskier, payments stalled, and the cost of resolving disputes rose with each jurisdictional break. The consequences were structural. Ottoman courts had functioned as economic stabilizers. They enforced contracts, protected property, and resolved disputes quickly, which supported long-distance trade and urban stability. When these courts were sidelined, local economies were disrupted. Legal fragmentation increased uncertainty. raising the cost of doing business and weakening trust in institutions. Hierarchy replaced reciprocity. Community voices quieted beneath centralized chains of command, while military power loomed behind benches that once answered to the public record. This shift also changed the nature of power. Colonial legal systems centralized authority but removed local accountability. Judges answered upward, not outward. Law became a tool of administration rather than a check on it. The restraint that once limited officials was replaced by coercion backed by military presence. Queues lengthened and stamps multiplied. Procedures served administration more than accountability, and ordinary petitioners waited as files moved instead of judgments. Why does this matter today? Because many regions once governed by Ottoman courts inherited the structures imposed after their removal, not the systems that preceded them. Legal mistrust, bureaucratic delay, and unequal enforcement did not emerge in a vacuum. They followed a deliberate replacement of institutions that had prioritized predictability and access. Influence flowed both ways before it narrowed. Ideas crossed borders, were adopted then abandoned when advantage demanded, reshaping how institutions worked on the ground. This history also challenges a common assumption that legal modernity flowed in one direction. In reality, European systems learned from Ottoman practice before abandoning it when power dynamics shifted. Understanding that sequence helps explain why law, markets, and governance function differently across regions today. The Ottoman courts were not perfect, but they were systematic, accessible, and widely respected, including by those who would later dismantle them. Their removal was not the result of legal failure, but of political and military force. For History Watch, I'm YAMO. Good night.